What's up, my friend? Welcome back to another video. And today I'm really excited to share this one with you because I'm going to walk through the exact process I used to master my own album from start to finish. And the disclaimer I want to make right off the bat is that I am not a mastering engineer by any means. I decided to do this because I wanted to learn basically how to master, and I wanted the full control over my own results. And I'm pretty happy with how it turned out, and I hope that this video can help you in terms of finding a relatively streamlined workflow for mastering your own album in case you're interested in this sort of thing. And of course, at any time, if you want to check out my full composing process, orchestration, how I think of ideas and go through the entire writing process to get a polished final master, then I'd invite you to check out my free workshop down below in the description called the Complete Composer's Framework. And it's an on-demand workshop you can check out anytime to check out my full music making process. But with that being said, let's kind of jump into the mastering process here. So I've kind of split this up into 5 different steps, if you will. And the first one is what I would consider absolute volume. And for me, absolute volume is just the actual volume in reality. So like, how loud is your music in the real world? Of course, there's always relative volume, right? Like how loud is one track in relation to another, but absolute volume, I'm thinking more so about how actually loud is your music. And so this is where a loudness meter is really, really useful. And the one I decided to use is Julian Loudness Meter 2. It's completely free. You can buy a pro version if you'd like to, but this is a super, super handy tool. Now, before we actually listen to the music itself, I just want to go over 2 specific values that I think are really important. And the first one here is the integrated LUFS, which basically means the average loudness over a long period of time. So usually that would be over the duration of the entire song. If you play from start to finish and the loudness meter is picking up the entire song, then this value will tell you the average volume of that of the entire track, basically. Short-term LUFS is basically exactly what it sounds like, the loudness over a short period of time, usually around 3 seconds or so, I believe. But the integrated one is sort of the more important one because that tells us the average volume over a longer period of time, and therefore that's usually the entire track. The other value that's also really important here is the true peak max. And this is important because we want the true peak to be no higher than 0 dB, right? 0 dB is essentially when we hit the clipping distortion territory and it kind of ruins the entire recording. And we absolutely want to avoid that. So what you would usually want to do is set your limiter, your brick wall limiter, to a value less than 0. So maybe that's minus 0.1, 0.2. For me, just to be super safe, I kept it at minus 0.5, just to ensure that if the track does peak at all above minus 0.5, it's not going to hit 0 and distort and clip, right? So those are the couple values that are really, really important, the integrated and the true peak max. So that being said, the first thing I wanted to do was make sure that all of my tracks reached around minus 8 or so integrated LUFS. And so there's this long held discussion of how loud should the music actually be in reality, right? There was a war about, should it be minus 14? Should it be a value slightly higher than that? And what people have found is that a lot of tracks nowadays are mastered at way higher levels than previously before. And the value that a lot of people are mastering at nowadays, that I'm seeing at least, is around minus 8, minus 9, minus 7, around there. So if we just play maybe this last section of my track here, let's take a look at the integrated LUFS and see what value that is.
Live my life. I know it's not an easy journey. It may catch me by surprise. I'll keep on striving for my best self, 'cause I've got a fire that'll never die. My heart's beating, a miracle that I'm still breathing, a chance for me to find my meaning today. Times are changing, the challenges I might be facing, replaced with all the dreams I'm chasing today.
All right, so let's just stop there. So basically the average volume across this entire section that I played was minus 9.1 or so. And so that's basically the range I was going for, minus 8, minus 9, and it's definitely louder than minus 14, right? Because if you want your track to compete with the other tracks that people are hearing on Spotify or other streaming services, you don't want the your track to suddenly dip down unless the software itself has like a normalizer that automatically boosts your track's volume. You want to sort of have a volume that's relatively comparable to the other commercial tracks. So in this case, I went for minus 9. Let's hear another one here. Maybe the chorus of my second song.
I like you, crazy as it seems. I'm breaking at the seams. I can't deny that I like you. I like you. Yeah, I like you. Yeah, I like you. Love to get your name. I promise it's no game. I'm curious 'cause I like you. I like you.
Right, so this one again, minus 9.6, around that same register. Let's have one more example. Maybe track number 8. Right, and this is the same idea. So you see short-term LUFS, especially in the last part of this song, it's actually a little bit higher. It's minus 8.4, which means it's a bit louder than the minus 9.1. But in terms of the average volume of this final chorus, it's around minus 9 as well. So that's the entire idea. I'm trying to get a consistent loud volume for the entire album. And that, like this kind of leads into the question, well, how do we ensure that all parts of the track, the individual tracks, are at the same level? And that's where automation comes in step number 4, as I've listed here. But just as a general, I guess, overall sort of view, I'm trying to get all the volumes at a consistent level. In this case, I've chosen minus 9.1. Now, you might also ask, is there an absolute correct volume to aim for? And from what I'm seeing, people are saying, no, you should master to the volume that is best for the music itself. And that statement, I think, applies very well to individual tracks, but then how does that apply to the overall album, right? And so in this case, I basically chose a track that I liked the mix of the most, that I wanted to use as sort of my reference track for the entire mastering process for the album. So it just how happened to be my very first track in the album. So I really liked this mix, and I wanted to master this track at minus 9 because I just felt it sounded the best for this track specifically, and then I used this as the reference for the rest of the album in terms of meeting that same loudness of track number 1. So that is step number 1, is making sure that I'm hitting that LUFS. And in case you're wondering about the actual technical side, I used this limiter here, Pro L2 by FabFilter, a very, very well-known company, I guess, in the plugin world. I use it all the time for my orchestral mixes as well. But essentially all I did here was turn up the gain because it defaults to 0 at the very bottom, so there's no gain being added. And your job basically is to push up the limiter until it reaches that LUFS that you're happy with. So in this case, minus 9. So see here how in the second chorus, there's these peaks. And so, well, it's going to keep scrolling. I forgot how to stop it from doing that. But basically, you saw there was those little compression happening right at the very top, just meaning that the compressor is acting on the track and making it a little bit quieter. But if we play the final chorus, I'm going to expect those little push downs of the volume, those compressions of the audio to be a little bit more severe. See all the red there. Right, so you get the general idea, right? All the peaks are just a little bit more aggressive, and being a brick wall limiter, it's not going to let any of the audio come up above that certain level that I'm stating. And in this case, I put it right here. In terms of the output, I selected minus 0.5, meaning that that true peak is maximum going to be minus 0.5. So that's basically how I did it. You want to set the limiter to your absolute highest output value or the peak value, right? So that in terms of the true peak, the track does not go above that level. And then just make sure that the rest of the track is hitting that integrated LEOFS that you're going for. In my case, -9 or -8. And there we go. That is step number 1. So step number 2 was relative volume, right? And so after I got the absolute volume of my one track, then the relative volume is more so about, are the rest of the tracks consistent in volume as well? And of course I did this with a limiter because every single track needs its own limiter to boost up the volume to its desired volume, right? So for example, if we hear track number 3, it should be pretty similar in volume to track number 1. Right, so here actually you can see track number 3 is a little bit louder compared to track number 1. But like once I sort of got into the ballpark, I started to use my ears a bit more, and I decided that this volume, I was happy with it. I didn't really need to tweak it anymore after that. And I just so happened to boost this one. Actually, let me find the limiter here. There we go, Pro L2, by 10 dB. Almost 11. So this track naturally was quieter than the first track, and I had to push it up 10 dB so it basically hit the same volume as the first track, the same LUFS, right? Let's hear one more example here. So maybe track number 9. This one is more of an acoustic feel to it, but let's take a look at the final chorus.
Nice and slow. I've got to find out and take it slow. Feels like a new beginning. Oh, I might be shaking, you won't catch me like a deer in headlights.
There's a lot of limiting happening here, as you can see, on the highest, the loudest parts. Right, and so here you can see actually the true peak is a little bit higher than the -0.5. Let me see why actually, because I thought they set the limiter. Yeah, so I guess this one maybe, let me click it once again just to reset it. Let me double check. Okay, so I guess track number 9 was just overall a bit louder in terms of the true peak compared to the other ones. I'm just noticing this now. But overall, it's not clipping because it hasn't hit the actual 0 dB for true peak, right? But in terms of the integrated LEOFS, you can see it's still -8.2, so within the acceptable range that I've chosen. And for the limiter itself, I am pushing it about 10 dB as well. If we listen to the first chorus, it's a lot softer, I think.
Promise I'll see it.
But you can see there's still a little bit of limiting happening there on the loudest parts. And yeah, this part of the song is softer, so it's -11, right? So it's definitely quieter, but that's why the dynamics gradually build up to the final chorus. So as the listener, you can actually feel there's a bit of dynamic growth in the track. I didn't want to compress it so hard or limit it so hard that there wasn't any like real variance in the absolute dynamic. So that's step number 2. It's just ensuring that all the tracks have the same relative volume, basically, across the entire album. Step number 3 is in terms of tonal consistency. So once the general volume has been established for all the different tracks, then I wanted to move on to does the whole album actually sound consistent tonally? And that just means in terms of brightness, darkness, you can see how EQ comes in here. And that's why I put in an EQ for these tracks as well. So my EQ of choice is Pro Q3. And, the name of the game here, I think, is just to make very, very subtle moves so that the tracks all fit together in terms of the tone. Whether that be a brighter sound, or you want a darker mixes as a whole, or you want something a bit muddier or boomier, whatever it might be, or a lot of high end. You make your own choice. This album is more poppy in nature, so I wanted something more crispy sounding, right, with some high end, but not overly high. And I also wanted some of the beefy low end as well. So in this case, I felt that this opening track, Live My Life, was a little bit too heavy in the mid-range. So that's why I notched out some of the mids here, minus 1.68. So let's have a listen.
Easy journey.
Let's turn off the EQ for a second.
It may catch me by surprise.
Done.
I'll keep on striving for my best.
Yeah, so the difference is actually quite subtle. Like I can barely hear it here on my headphones, but to my ears, it does clean it up just a little bit. It sort of allows the highs to sing out a little bit more, or be a little bit more evident. And whereas, you know, compared to some of these other tracks, which are way more poppy and high-end in nature, I wanted this sort of to match more tonally to that. Speaking of which, the second track, I Like You, let me see the EQ for this one. Let's open this one up. So see here, I made a couple more changes. I did find the low end, I guess, a little bit heavy here, so I notched that out. Let's have a listen. Right, so now the EQ is off, and you can hear it's a little darker.
My racing heart,
But now,
my brain won't start.
with the EQ actually activated, it does liven up just a little bit to my ears. It sounds a little cleaner, okay? So now I'm happy with how track number 1 and track number 2 sound together, because track number 1 has a bit of a deeper orchestral sound to it, but it still opens up and it feels like there's that stereo spread. There's a sense of brightness to it. And track number 2, I think, maintains that brightness. So I wanted to achieve that sort of tonal consistency across the first 2 tracks and therefore across the entire album as well. So that is step number 3, is tonal consistency. This is where you want to go in with your EQ, listen very carefully, go from your reference track to the track you're working on, and just to double check, are those tracks consistent in terms of how they sound tonally? Bright, dark, muddy, whatever it might be. Okay, so in this track here, Indecision, you can see I took out some of the mid-range, boosted a bit of the highs and the lows because I wanted the thump there with the kick drum, and I wanted some of the vocals to come out a bit more. Turn it off. Bit muddier, right? Yeah, and then with it turned on, I can feel the kick a little bit more, and the vocal just brightens up just a bit there. So that's step number 3. Step number 4 is basically the final polish for volume automation. So in this case, I'm just going through and like if any of the parts of the song, for example, are too quiet, let's say the first verse, the first chorus, I'm going to go through and actually turn that up myself, because I don't want to rely on the compressor and the limiter to do absolutely everything. And this process is actually pretty easy because you can look at the actual waveform of these tracks, right? So if we zoom in a bit, I didn't do any automation for track number 8, as you can see, because the waveform is relatively consistent. Maybe the first verse and pre-chorus are a little quieter, but you know, relatively consistent. But here for Headlights, for example, you can see that the track really does get louder at the very end, and then at the very beginning, it's boosted up 0.5 dB compared to the very end because the waveform is smaller and it actually sounded softer. So I'm just going through and making sure that the final volumes are set in terms of the automation. And then the very final step is just having one more listen through the entire thing just to make sure that the album flows the way I want it to. And this also means that if you have transitions from song to song, you're going to want to make sure those flow seamlessly as well. And that's sort of another art in itself. Like in this case, this album, they're individual songs, they're not connected through transitions. So I didn't really have to worry about that. But if you did, then you'd have to make sure that you kind of put each track one after the other, sort of like this. Oops. Sort of like this. And you want to make sure that that transition, when you go from track 1 to track 2, you don't want any gaps or any bumps or anything, right? So this is really, really important. And you want to zoom in and make sure that, you know, the tracks are lined up perfectly. And when you bounce, you know, each of the individual tracks, make sure all the timestamps or the time markers are very consistent, etc. But in my case, I didn't need to do that. So yeah, and then in terms of exporting, I would take the track and I would have basically a listen to the very beginning and the very end. So for example, let's listen to track 1. Okay, so where does the sound actually come in? It comes in like at 1 So bar 1, beat 4, and then it's like the fourth part of this beat, basically, right? This MIDI beat. So I would set the export beginning to start right here because I want the track to start as soon as the listener presses play on this track. I don't want them to hear a couple seconds of silence from the very, very beginning, right? So I set the export value right here, which would be 1441. So let's take a look here. If I press bounce, I would go 1, 4, 4, 1. And then the export value, I would have to find out by listening to the very end of the track. Where do I want the track to end and for the next track to begin? So the piano's fading away. Let's say I'm happy with everything until 129. 129 is where I want the track to cut off and track number 2 to begin. And so I would set the end marker, which is called the end right there, to 129. As you can see, they've actually written down 129. But if I wanted to cut off right on the downbeat, then I would set these other values to 1, just like this. And then you export. Now, I basically keep normalize off because I don't want Logic applying any of its own volume boosting because I've already done that process with the mastering basically myself. And of course you want to export it in terms of WAV and MP3 just for multiple qualities of audio files and for distribution's sake. So that's also an important thing to do too. Just to get the highest quality audio, WAV or AIFF I think are the basic ones or the most common ones to use there. So that was a relatively long video compared to my other ones, but I hope that kind of helped here. So just to quickly recap, number 1 is absolute volume. I'm using the combination of my limiter, in this case Pro L2, just to boost up the volume to an integrated LUFS I'm happy with, in this case -8 or -9. So again, that would be different compared to your track, right? If it's a hip hop track or maybe a classical track, you might choose a different LUFS. But I think -8 or -9 is pretty standard nowadays. Sometimes even -7, I believe some people have done. But once you get that absolute volume you want, you just want to make sure all the tracks have that similar volume across the entire album. So that's step number 2. It's just ensuring that once you are happy with the track, with one track's volume and you use that as a reference, then the other tracks should match in terms of volume as well, relatively speaking, right? So that would be step number 2. Step number 3 is going through with an EQ on each track and making any micro adjustments you need just to make sure they all tonally fit together from start to finish. You don't want one track being suddenly darker and like really, really muddy compared to all the other ones which are super bright. So EQ comes into play here, and maybe a bit of compression too. If the dynamics are varying pretty wildly, then maybe you apply a bit of compression. But that also leads us into step number 4, being the volume automation, where you can go through and ask yourself, are there any parts of the track which are too quiet or too loud? And you can manually turn them up or down yourself, which is pretty cool. And then step number 5 is just listening once or twice through the entire record again. At this point, you're probably pretty tired of the album because you've worked on it, assuming you've done all the work yourself, producing it, arranging it, mixing it. But I think it's worth it to have one more listen through the entire thing just to ensure that you can close your eyes, enjoy the overall sound, and just sign off on it for good, right? A lot of us, we just continue to tweak and over perfect, and we just don't get anything out there. So I think in this case, you really want to be able to sit through it and just enjoy the entire thing and just ensure the whole album flows from start to finish. All right, so that's basically how I mastered my album. Again, your process might be completely different. And again, my process could be wrong, of course. I'm not a mastering engineer. Again, this is just what I did for my album, but I'm pretty happy with my results. When I listen through the album from start to finish, it feels consistent to me. It feels loud enough to me across the entire thing. When I compare it to some of the other tracks on my playlists, the volumes are pretty consistent, I feel like. So I'm pretty happy with it. But if you have different ways of doing things, please feel free to let me know down below too. Like, I'm happy to learn. I'm always looking for new tips and tricks to incorporate into my workflow too. But I just wanted to share with you what I did for my album here. So again, I really appreciate you watching. If you want to check out my full composing workflow, how I think of ideas, write them out, orchestrate them, mix and master them, then feel free to check out my workshop down below in the description called the Complete Composer's Framework. And I'll walk through step by step how I actually go through that music making process all the way from the very beginning to the very end, and it's on demand. It's completely free, so you can watch it anytime. And it's a thank you for watching this video today. So I'll catch you in the next video. Appreciate it, and I'll see you soon. Take care.